Welcome to the Hang Time Podcast. I'm your host, Sekou Smith, here in the Orlando bubble, watching fantastic basketball, but also grappling with the realities of life on a contained campus. And I'm a short timer. I haven't been here the whole time, but there are some other folks down here in the bubble who have been here for the duration, and they need the assistance of today's guests more than anybody I can think of. Brian Levenson is a mental performance coach and author, a listener, and somebody who's studied the things that a lot of us take for granted that we don't think about. And he's got a fantastic book. I'm just thumbing through it for the first time myself, but it's called Shift Your Mind, and it's been very helpful. Brian, good morning. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you don't charge by the minute, because I got questions that need answering, and I'm not sure we can afford you.
Sekou, I literally just got off the phone with an MBA agent, and I said to him, I'm not a lawyer. I don't charge for my time like that. And we're trying to get one of his guys to start working with him. And you said something that I have never been introduced as, which is a listener. And for me, man, like as I've gotten older, I appreciate that more and more and more and more. And I think as we all are going through challenging times, I find myself, I'm very convicted. I'm someone who's passionate, energetic, and I've always been that way ever since I was a kid, as long as I can remember. But I think curiosity and listening is so underrated. So I'm going to do a lot of talking today, but I love being on the other side of the mic where I get to ask questions and learn and grow, and like not just listening to respond or listening to share your own thoughts, but listening to understand. And I think this is a really interesting time where people need to listen to each other with curiosity and then have conviction.
And I'm fascinated by this whole field of mental performance, whether it's coaching, teaching, whatever it is. It's that thing we didn't have a term for maybe 30 years ago. Nobody was really giving it coining a phrase to capture that intangible, not the physical thing that you do if you're an athlete or if you're a performer even. I think it would apply to performance artists, anybody. When did you make that connection and realize that was something that you had an interest in and something that you could be helpful to people in?
So I'll give like a quick background on myself. I was a lost puppy out of college. No idea what I wanted to do. Always loved sports, probably like you. I don't know, maybe I want to write. I had an NBA draft website at one point. I was interested in maybe coaching in sports, maybe scouting. I don't know, but I love sports. It's easy. Everyone that's listening to this conversation loves sports. Okay, cool. But over the years, what I really started to realize is that I love helping people. And I think most humans love that as well. But for me, I had lunch with a woman named Julie Ellian one day. And Julie was a mental performance coach for a lot of golfers. She also did some work with the Wizards and a couple other pro teams. And our conversation just flowed. And she said to me, Brian, I think you'd be really good at this. This is an emerging, growing field. This was in 2007. And I, at the time, was like, I don't want to go back to school. I want to work. And I've been in school my whole life. And after years of working in sales, I went back to her and she started mentoring me. I took an online class. I started to shadow her and really owe her a ton. I mean, the word privilege gets thrown out a lot. And I'm privileged for a lot of different reasons, but really privileged to have access to Julie early in my career. And so she helped me figure out where to go to grad school. I went to grad school for sports psychology. And, today I would say half of my practice is working with athletes on the mental side of performance, and the other half is working with executives and companies on their mindset and how they can show up to lead others. And the last thing I'll say is I think it's important to make a distinction between classic psychology, mental health, things like depression and severe anxiety, and mental performance. And it obviously doesn't mean that the mental health doesn't impact the performance and the performance doesn't impact the health. But for me, what I specialize in is trying to help people with their mindset for preparation and their mindset for performance. And so, depression is something, anxiety, panic attacks. These are things that have come to the forefront with Kevin Love, DeMar DeRozan, recently Dak Prescott, Paul George. We're hearing these conversations. So when people are struggling with that stuff, I often refer them to a clinical psychologist who specializes in that work. And believe me, I have referred a lot of people over the years to clinical psychologists because the reality is I work with human beings, and human beings go through stuff just like everybody else. And whether they're an athlete or they're a movie star or they are a business person, it doesn't discriminate. Like clinical depression does not discriminate. And so that's a little bit about me, my background, and what I do.
I wonder what your thought was when you heard. I mean, I did a podcast with Kevin Love after he'd come out with, I think, his article in the Players Tribune, and really talked about these things that have been taboo largely in a machismo field that is professional sports and competing at that level. What's going through your mind when you heard Paul George talk about his struggles here in the bubble? Because that was the first player I could remember saying anything about it publicly. And then it was kind of a flood. Everybody that was here, everybody that was on their way here, like me, started thinking like, of course, I didn't even think about that affecting a guy's performance on the court, just what he was dealing with when he's not on the court.
I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge the courage that it takes to share and the vulnerability. And there's a woman named Brene Brown who has studied vulnerability and links vulnerability to courage. And she's gone to military bases and asked these people that have literally been in war, how many of you value courage? And especially as men, we're taught that courage is a good thing. We're often taught that vulnerability is not a good thing. And I think that's a mistake. And she thinks that's a mistake based on her research. So you think about, we're watching great basketball, right? Like we're watching Jamal Murray, we're watching Jokic, we're watching LeBron, Anthony Davis, we're watching Butler, Tyler Hero, we're watching Jason Tatum, Jalen Brown. I mean, the quality of the bubble basketball, which we can chat about as well, has been remarkable. And I'm getting texts because people know I'm a basketball head from all these other friends saying, dude, this is nuts. This is amazing. And so it's an interesting dynamic. And the reason I bring that up is because all of those guys have to be vulnerable in order to play like that. Jamal Murray going up and under and taking shots off of 1 foot, and Tyler Hero, jacking up threes, even when it looks like Jay Crowder might kill him when he misses him in the corner and he's open for 3. Like that requires vulnerability. It's putting yourself out there and knowing that you could get burned, you could get embarrassed, you could get shamed. And so the first thing I think it's important is to encourage these conversations, because the truth is, whether you're Robin Williams or you're Anthony Bourdain or you're Bruce Springsteen, name your elite performer, like these are all people that battled depression. From the outside looking in, like Bruce Springsteen's literally the boss. Like that's his nickname, right? And we see Robin Williams on stage and we're blown away. And then we can't understand how he could take his own life. And so we need to start having more and more of these conversations. So the Kevin Loves of the world, to me, are courageous. And that vulnerability is essential. And then there's another component to this, which is when we face adversity, I think there are 3 paths. There's a victim, which says, why me? Why am I going through this? There's a survivor who says, it is what it is, and they accept it. And then there's a thriver that says, hey, watch what I'm going to do. And so the second part of this that I think is essential and important is let's encourage people to put themselves out there, make themselves vulnerable. And they don't have to announce it to the world, but maybe they can announce it to their friends or their inner circle or their family, whatever it looks like to them. Let's not judge them. Let's accept it. Let's be aware of it. And let's understand that in that moment, they may be in a victimized mindset. And that might be exactly where they need to be. When someone passes away, I had a good friend pass away during COVID of cancer, 37 years old. He actually worked for the WNBA.
Wow.
And, like his family, like why me is appropriate right now. Like that is an appropriate response to it. But if they live their entire life in that state, like that's going to lead to some depression and some really, really tough stuff. So eventually you got to shift from why me to acceptance. and survival, right? When we go through cancer and we survive, we call them a survivor. Holocaust survivors, sexual assault survivors. So there needs to eventually be an acceptance. And then what's amazing is what inspires me is when people like Kevin Love then use their mess to create a message. And they say, hey, I went through this. Now watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to educate. I'm going to get help. And then I'm going to say, hey, watch what I'm going to do. And so I think it's important not to say that anyone has to be in any of those stages at the time when we think they should be. But I do think it's important that we also add that to the conversation, which is, hey, someone might be in that state right now. How do we help them get to survivor mode? And then ultimately, I think every human being wants to flourish, wants to thrive. And I think that's part of the education as well that we still need as a society.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I was here. I went to practice when we had media availability after the Breonna Taylor grand jury decision was rendered. And I was curious what the reaction of the players and coaches would be, given the stance that they took when they decided to come here and restart a season and finish it, knowing that the social justice conversation was a huge part of why they wanted to be here. I know how taxing it is just as a human being, a person who has family, a wife, kids, and you're worried about their well-being. And then you have this added cloud of, what's going on around the country to deal with, in addition to what you have to do every day in whatever your job is. I don't care what position you have. How do you help somebody manage all these competing interests, when you're trying to perform your best at your job every day, with this on your mind or that on your mind or this hovering over you? I mean, how do you even begin to try and manage all these things?
So we could talk about Paul George and maybe some of the struggles he had, but what I would rather do is talk about some of these guys who are balling. And when you're watching these dudes who definitely are carrying that, they've been open about it. LeBron's been open about it. Jamal Murray's been open about it. It's top of mind, and they're still going out and balling. And I think that's, to me, the thriver. That's the one that's saying, man, I'm like, that stuff's real. And when I get between the lines, I need to shift my mind. When I'm doing what I do, I need to be focused on that. And they create systems and processes, whether those are routines. I know you've been around the NBA for a long time. One of my favorite moments is sitting there before the game starts and watching these guys get ready to perform, right. and watching them during the national anthem has become more of a thing. But for me, I love watching guys, how they focus and get themselves ready to go. Mm-hmm. And some guys might be like Russ Westbrook or Kevin Garnett and get themselves really lathered up. And other guys might be meditating on the side, like CJ McCollum might be doing. And so for me, I think one of the things that I'm really intrigued by is, for all of us, this is hitting you in a certain way, yet you still have a job to do. And I always say, you can give 100% of whatever you've got. So maybe you're at 70%. You can still give 100% of that 70. I always think about Isaiah Thomas, spraining his ankle in the fourth quarter for the Detroit Pistons and having an incredible game, and doing that, hobbling around and having this epic game. I think about Brett Favre after his dad passes away on Monday Night Football and having this epic game. And so humans are very resilient. And I'm watching Jamal Murray right now, and I'm just blown away by his capacity to compete and to shift his mind to get himself ready to perform. That stands out to me when him and Donovan Mitchell were going back and forth. It's that's the stuff I tend to focus on. I'm not a troubleshooter. So I'm not somebody who's people would say, oh, that person choked. I'm like, all right, well, let's see how you do in the arena with, with usually 20,000 fans and millions watching. But I'm blown away by the Miami Heat and how those dudes are competing. So I think we tend to want to focus on the guy who's not able to do it. But I think one of the amazing things in working with pro athletes over the years is I've always been in awe of their ability to compartmentalize, and how many of us are able to do that with our craft when we're being judged and evaluated. And there's a lot on the line, whether it's financial, from a legacy standpoint, from a pride standpoint, from a fulfillment standpoint. And so when I'm watching this bubble, to me, one of the things that elite performers do is they don't let their environment drive their mindset. And so while the crowd is nice and the crowd can give them an energy boost, they're not reliant on the crowd to compete. Jimmy Butler's probably a guy that you're watching and you're just like, he's just balling, right? He's here to play ball. Let's roll it out. And I think it's one of the things that have given the Miami Heat an advantage during all of this is like a lot of those guys are just competitors and they don't care if they're playing street ball in the park or when nobody's watching. Like, I think a lot of those guys, like they play ball to compete and to give their best and to see what's going to happen. And I think the elite performers, if you look at a lot of the best performers in anything, they're going to play at a certain level regardless of what the environment is. And they've trained themselves to do that. And they've trained what I call their performance mind to be in a certain headspace when they're between the lines. I've always been amazed by Richard Sherman outside of, in another sport, because he's obviously famous for talking to Michael Crabtree after a game and, being mic'd up. But Richard is this really bright guy who is articulate and obviously, went to Stanford and really thoughtful guy. But when he's between the lines, he knows he needs to be a certain way. Kobe obviously created the Black Mamba for himself. You study a lot of elite performers and you recognize that they really set their mind for performance so that when they're between the lines, they won't let the environment get in the way of their capacity or their ability to perform.
Anybody could talk about the theories behind this. I know you can read books and kind of get a clinical understanding for how this works. You have a unique perspective. I've known you obviously for a long time. Your dad was one of the owners, part of the ownership group of the Atlanta Spirit that owned the Atlanta Hawks for a time. So I know you've had some interactions in opportunities to see how this works behind the scenes, that an intimate look at it that maybe a lot of people haven't gotten. How much of what you gathered, being an observant person and being attentive during that time, has factored into some of the thoughts and theories that you formulated yourself about how these players and people perform in these spaces?
Yeah, I've seen it from multiple angles because I've been in the war room on draft day and see what goes into that. But then on the other side, like it was kind of strange for me because I got hired by other teams to go to the NBA Combine in Chicago and interview players. So I've worked with agents to prep their guys for the NBA Combine. Look, number one, talent matters. Like, let's not sugarcoat it. Like, we're watching Anthony Davis and LeBron James, like two of the top 5 players in the world. You need talent. All right, so let's just start there. Beyond that, like what fulfills someone's potential is typically what's between their ears. That's the driver. And that is really what sets the ceiling. And that's where the guys that I've been mentioning over the course of the last 20 minutes or so, that's the stuff that separates them. And, your listeners know the guys and you can see it. I mean, there are guys that are driven. There are also guys who understand. So I think most NBA players would say that they're perfectionistic. And I would see them be perfectionistic, whether that's watching film or the way their routines would be or however they'd approach it. That's great in preparation, but they need to be adaptable in performance. And in performance, it's not about being perfectionistic. And James Harden is such a good example of this. I mean, he perfects every move that he does. But if the dude, I think last year in the playoffs, he went 0 for 14. And then with 2.5 minutes left, he scores like 5 or 7 points, makes a 3, gets a steal, like takes over the game. And afterwards, I think it was Cassidy who interviewed him. And she's like, well, so what were you thinking when you were 0 for 14? And he's like, I was 0 for 14. He didn't know. He wasn't focused on that. And then Chris Paul's like, yeah, we don't focus on that. And he's like, that's why we train. We perfect our craft in preparation so that we can be adaptable in performance. And so for me, and this is really what the book is all about, is these elite performers that recognize, hey, in preparation, I have to be one way. And then in performance, I need to be another way. And they make sure that they're not in their preparation mind when they're performing is huge. So I've seen a lot of NBA players who do the preparation. They do the work. They're humble in preparation, but then they're not arrogant in performance. They're not vulnerable. They don't have this inner sense of belief in themselves. And that gets in the way for them. I think of a Ray Allen who put all the work in, like no one would doubt his work ethic, but yet when he misses a bunch of shots, he's still playing basketball. So work in preparation, but then playing basketball. Basketball is meant to be played. Everyone talks about Michael Jordan as this killer and this crazy work ethic. But if you ever listen to Michael interviewed, he always said basketball is meant to be played. And before the game started, he would joke around. He would do pranks. He would be relaxed. So I think there's intentionality that the elite of the elite do. And I think for some of them that are super talented, they don't always set their mind in preparation and performance. And they expect that, well, I prepared a certain way, so why wouldn't I perform a certain way? There's not an acknowledgement of the shift that they need to make.
Yeah, really, it's the unknown for a lot of people. It's like, it's stuff that you know innately, but you haven't come up with a way to talk about it, or you maybe haven't been vulnerable enough with somebody else to talk about it. How do you break through that shell with players when agents hire you or a team hires you to come, work with their players?
So I would answer it two ways. Number one, there is no industry that I've ever been involved with that is more paranoid than sports. And when I say industry, I mean front office, I mean players, I mean coaches, and I mean media. And there's like a paranoia that exists because it's very transactional in nature. You either win or you lose. And I think the best organizations are not as transactional and more transformational and are more long-term focused, whether you look at the Heat or the Spurs or whoever you want to focus in on, the Celtics. But I think the paranoia does play a role. So the first part I would say is when I work with a team or an individual, I just let them know I have their back. I try to cultivate a relationship with them, and I let them know that I'm here for them. And there was one team that I worked with where I'd work with all the players, but the captain of the team would not work with me one-on-one. Like I don't take it personally, but you know what I would do, Sekou, is I'd go to lunch and I'd sit there at lunch and we'd talk about a book that he was reading. And then I'd go to the locker room and I'd sit there in the locker room and we'd chat for an hour. And I don't think he realized I was working. So to me, you have to show up in whatever way they're comfortable with. And for some guys, rightfully so, they're paranoid about meeting with someone who's getting paid by an organization to work one-on-one with. And other guys are completely open and vulnerable. And so I think you have to meet people where they are. And I do group talks as well. So there's an opportunity to reach someone in a group talk that maybe it wouldn't be one-on-one. Some guys, it's text message. Some guys, it's a phone call. So for me, I've never said it's about me. It's always about serving them. And my job is to meet them wherever they are, to be in service to them. And one of the things I always said, I said it to a pro athlete once, like after we stop our meeting, I often would say, I've got your back. And once again, in a paranoid industry, to say to someone, hey, I've got your back can go a long way. And like Sekou, like I think you've had my back for years now. I remember I had my NBA draft website and you helped promote it. Like, so I do think relationships win out over time. And I think that's a really big piece of it. And then the second piece I would say is that, the best way to cultivate a relationship with someone is to listen and to ask questions and to get to know who they are. And I'm very thoughtful. Like I don't promote the pro athletes that I work with. And I keep that confidential because I just feel like pro athletes get pulled on for so many things. And people try to use, I got a picture with this guy or my arms around him and now he's my guy. And for me, I'm more comfortable doing that with the executives I work with the sports coaches that I work with. But for pro athletes, I think it's important that you're just there for them sort of unconditionally and you're not there for yourself because of the nature. When you can get traded at your job, like, that's just a little different. Like there's no other industry where, you know what, we're going to trade you for some money or no, you know what, for future considerations, actually, we're going to trade you for that or we're going to trade you for a draft pick. And we don't even know who that person is or a player to be named later in other sports. Like the transactional nature of that, I'm hyper aware of. So for me and how I work, I think it's really important that I cultivate relationships and I am patient with people. And so that's sort of how I think about it.
Yeah. This has to be such a fascinating time for somebody in that realm that you work in and really have to exist in. wholeheartedly. I was talking about this yesterday with a producer from NBAE. They're capturing obviously what's going down here at the bubble, and for historical purposes. 20 years from now, this will be a fascinating look back at a tumultuous year, 2024, just for the country. But think about it in the NBA's parlance. We started the year with David Stern passing away. 26 days later, Kobe Bryant, his daughter, 7 other people die in a helicopter crash. We get to All-Star Weekend in Chicago, Brian, and it was kind of a release. Everybody was glad to see each other. You kind of gather the entire NBA ecosystem and you kind of exhale a little bit. And then before you know it, less than a month later, March 11th, the league shuts down and we end up with this, 4.5 months hiatus from the season because of the coronavirus pandemic. So there's just been all these hits, one after another. They get here, and then it almost comes to a shutdown because of Jacob Blake shooting in Wisconsin, and the Bucks, decide not to take part. I mean, that's just been one seismic hit after another. So people ask me, well, whoever wins this championship, it'll be different because it wasn't done in the traditional way. I don't know if it's the same. In my mind, this will be probably the most extraordinary NBA champion that I can think of in my lifetime because of all that. And I'm wondering, how do you put those puzzle pieces together from your perspective when you look at all that somebody will have to have survived in the calendar year to get to host an Larry O'Brien trophy when we're done down here?
I agree wholeheartedly. I think there should be an asterisk because it should be or a star. Maybe they put a star next to it because I think I just keep saying I've been blown away by the resilience of everybody that's involved with this. Basketball also lost John Thompson. They lost Lute Olson. Our society lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We lost John Lewis. Yeah. We lost, musicians like Kenny Rogers. If you're, into music, I mean, we lost the Black Panther. I mean, and these people are ranging in age. Some of these people, you could say, oh well, they're in their 80s, and this is nature, and this is what happens. And then others are just completely shocking. For me, one of the things I love about sports is I do think it often mirrors life. And here's why. Sports are a wicked environment. It is unknown. You said unknown earlier. Sports is the ultimate unknown. Nobody had the Heat. We're recording this on Friday. Heat win tonight. They go to the NBA Finals. Nobody had the Heat going to the NBA Finals. Nobody. Nobody had.
Well, outside of Jimmy Butler, maybe nobody.
Or outside the Heat. No, I think that's right. Outside the Heat, yeah, they did, right? That's what I have so much respect. Talk about they're willing to say that and be that and that out there. And I think that requires a little inner arrogance, when nobody else believes in us, but we believe in ourselves. That's what I call arrogance. Mm-hmm. But the unknown of sports to me is what actually life is. As we started this conversation, you don't know if you're going to wake up tomorrow. Right. I hate to be morbid,
no, that's true,
but it is the truth. You could be any of the people that I just mentioned that pass away. And so sports is this wicked environment that is evaluated. It's judged. It's intense. It has meaning. It has power. And for me, I don't think that's all that different than all of our lives. And can we take our lives with the same intention and purpose and discipline and grit and hard work and willingness to be vulnerable that a lot of these athletes do? So that's why I get inspired by sports. I get inspired by athletes. We're seeing another level of it with the thoughtfulness and the conscientiousness of this generation's athletes. And I think there's an amazing dynamic because, to your point, we're seeing a conscientiousness level without a drop in the competitiveness. And that to me is so intriguing because for so long there was this idea that you can't be more than one thing. You have to just be singularly focused. And it's a lie. And the research doesn't back it up. The research shows that if you have hobbies, you can actually perform at a higher level because we need rest. We need contemplative space. We need reflection. It's why you see a lot of athletes go to go to God and pray, because they use that to space to reflect and then to let themselves go and deal with the unknown in a useful manner. So I say all that to say that, like, to me, Kobe's preparation mind and performance mind are the best I've ever seen in sports. Like, the way he would shift his mind in preparation and performance was unbelievable. And the reality is, like, nobody expected him to not be here anymore. And it was tragic, and losing the other people in the helicopter as well is brutal. And as human beings, I think it's important. That's why we do have to stand up for what we believe in, because we just don't know what tomorrow will bring. And if we don't put it on ourselves to make this world a little bit better, who else will? Nobody else will. It's up to us. So rather than run away from the unknown, I think we have to embrace it. We have to acknowledge it. We have to sit in it, sit in the discomfort of the unknown, so that you can be comfortable with what you're doing. Think about the future and think about how you want to show up so that you can be present when you need to be. And so I think this mistake that we make, that we all need to be one way, it hurts us. It hinders us. We need to think about how we can hold more than one thing at once. And we don't have to be humble all the time. We don't have to be perfectionistic all the time. We don't have to be selfless all the time. There's a time to also be selfish. And that's essentially what the book is about. And that's the framework that I use when I work with people.
That's awesome stuff. Brian Levenson, the book is Shift Your Mind, 9 Mental Shifts to Thrive in Preparation and Performance. It's awesome stuff. I'm gonna keep digging through this thing, because I think it offers some really cool connections that you can make. Thank you, Brian, for your time, my man. Always good to talk to you, and very happy for you with the book and all your success.
Thanks for the support, Sekou. And yeah, I have a bunch of questions for you, being in that environment and what you've observed and what you've noticed. I wrote my thesis on home court advantage. And one of the things, I actually talked to Howard Beck about this for an article he wrote. And I'm really intrigued about what it's like from the player's perspective, dealing with not really having a home court or being on the road, and how that impacts them from an energy standpoint. I think this is just an interesting experiment from a performance standpoint. And the last thing I'll leave your listeners with is, you asked me, like, what have I noticed that, whether it's an organization, seen behind the curtain of organizations or the work that I do. And I also have a podcast that's called Intentional Performers. And the reason it's called Intentional Performers is I started it was called Beyond the Surface, and we were going to go beyond the playing surface with a lot of performers. And about 30 episodes in, I realized that all of these performers were very intentional with how they were approaching their life. And they were setting things up in systems to make sure that they could be the best version of them. And so I think as we all go through this time, and I'm sure in the bubble it's the same way, those that are being intentional with how they're approaching it have an unfair advantage than those who are just reacting to it. And so I think it's up to all of us to be intentional with how we show up, how we treat people, what the words that we say, and how we engage with the world. I think that's a big piece of it for me, is I'm trying to be as intentional as I can be, while knowing that sometimes an environment will dictate my behavior. And I need to be aware of when that's happening so that I can hopefully shift out of that. And the sooner that I realize that, the more access I have to myself and what I can do in it. So as you're in that bubble, like, I think just being intentional with what you want the experience to be, while knowing that it's wicked and sometimes bad things happen and some things just suck, and acknowledging that as well is important. And look, this time right now, like, some things just suck. And I think if we just gloss over that and don't accept it and acknowledge it, we're missing it as well.
No doubt. Brian Levenson, always an interesting conversation, my friend. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, Sekou.